1998 was a banger of a year for Capcom. Resident Evil 2 was a hit and had made its way into various ports where people could enjoy the sequel that improved on everything the first game did. Even the owners of the N64 got a port of the game, which is a technical achievement on its own. It was so successful that Capcom immediately capitalized on the franchise and began a number of new projects to move the series forward. One was to be a game where we played as Hunk, an Umbrella soldier on board a ship recovering a sample of the G-Virus, which ended up being cancelled. Mind you too that this was towards the end of the PlayStation 1 cycle, and Capcom wanted at least one more sequel before the release of the PlayStation 2. But because of time constraints, Capcom decided to do two things. They got Kamiya and his team to move on to making Resident Evil 4, and one of the spin-off projects was repurposed into becoming the third sequel that would mark the end of the PS1 trilogy, which would be known as Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Originally though, a fairly new team within Capcom were charged to make a spin-off that involved a new character trying to escape Raccoon City, set during the events of Resident Evil 2. But eventually they decided to bring back an OG character that was already established, Jill Valentine herself. This is what would become Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, a game that was originally intended to expand more on what Resident Evil 2 accomplished, but the final product showed not only vast improvements over the gameplay and the location variety, but also has the most unique boss in the entire franchise, Nemesis himself, who was literally the face of this game. Its reception was in the high, cementing Capcom as a powerhouse in not just gaming but also the survival horror realm. It was the end of the trilogy, and sent off the Raccoon City saga with flying colours, and after playing it, I can say that this is easily the best game out of the three, even with some shortcomings of its own. Anyway, let's get into it. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis' story takes place during the Raccoon City outbreak. People are getting infected left, right and center, zombies are everywhere, mutating into monstrous creatures like the Hunters, Lickers or Spiders turning into giants. Shit was crazy. In Resident Evil 2, we saw the events taking place in the perspective of Leon and Claire. This time around though, we have Jill Valentine, one of the original characters from the first game, stuck in the same situation as everyone else. And her main priority right now is to get the fuck out of Dodge. Of course, it's easier said than done, because when you meet up with Brad, one of the other STARS members, he mentions something pretty ominous here.
Brad, hang in there. Why isn't someone doing something about this?
I didn't know you were still alive, Jill. The police aren't trained for this kind of situation. What could they do? Listen, he's coming for us. We're both gonna die.
What are you saying?
You'll see. He's after STARS members. There's no escape.
Something about a thing coming after STARS members, which is a shock to Jill. It was like in RE2 when Mr. X would keep coming after the characters, and being charged with the task of eliminating evidence including any survivors. We find out very quickly that we have the Tyrant and Mr. X on steroids. Nemesis himself, a walking force of nature akin to the T-800 or the T-1000 from the Terminator films. This character is the driving force of the entire narrative from beginning to end, targeting Jill and constantly on her trail. And as you progress, you also meet other characters too, like Carlos, Mikhail and Nikolai, who are mercenaries hired by Umbrella on a retrieval mission. Now, because of Jill's history with Umbrella and finding out what they've really been up to, she's initially skeptical about them. But because of her willingness to help others, as well as other characters like Carlos being genuine in his desire to help other people and do the right thing, she eventually does help them too, all the while being chased by Nemesis, as well as dealing with the ongoing outbreak that's completely torn the city apart. Resident Evil 3's storyline is more simple and streamlined compared to the second. It doesn't focus too much on Umbrella or the G-Virus this time around. It's simply an escape from New York style plot where you have overwhelming odds and a nearly unkillable creature trying to stop you from escaping the city. The story's strengths pull from several things, like the developments of characters like Jill and Carlos, the utilization of Nemesis himself, and finally the expanded exploration of Raccoon City, where it was a cock tease in Resident Evil 2. The biggest caveat of this game's story though is that it's short. In fact, it's the shortest game in the trilogy, also due to the fact that you have only one playable character to pick from, with the exception of Carlos when you take control of him briefly. It does, however, make up for it with the live selection system, which is a choice-based option that you make in the moment that calls for it. And the choice that you make significantly impacts the progression of the story. For instance, when you're in the clock tower, you have the option to push Nemesis off or use the cord. Pushing him off makes it so that he doesn't annoy you throughout the clock tower up until a certain point, and the cord option only buys you time before he starts chasing you again. Some choices make the progression of the game easier while others are harder, but multiple playthroughs are encouraged to see the different outcomes in each area, so to speak. The shortness of the game also extends from the simpler storyline and having only 2 bosses to contend with, the other being the Gravedigger. But speaking of Nemesis, when I played the remake of 3, I was incredibly disappointed that Nemesis wasn't the constant Terminator-like figure that I had heard about in the original RE3. And I'm saying this because I hadn't played the original game up until now. I didn't play the original before the remake, and I was still disappointed with the remake. But now that I have finally played the original, like I said, it cements how far the remake counterpart has fallen from grace. The original Nemesis is fucking amazing here, and he is probably my favourite boss in the entire franchise. The reason why is because his design and implementation within the game works in tangent within the story. No matter where you go, you don't feel safe, even in the save rooms where you have a moment of relief. His constant interference in your exploration of the game even made me paranoid with the idea that save rooms wouldn't be able to cut it this time around. He's got the strength of the Tyrant and Mr. X, and has the speed of a Hunter or a Licker. He is incredibly fast, can grab you and throw you around, and on some occasions he'll even whip out a rocket launcher and blow you up. He's also hard to fight, and in the beginning I found him very difficult and frustrating. But he is meant to be difficult and frustrating because he was designed to be an unkillable machine with one singular goal in mind. Stars. Nemesis has as much determination as a kid wanting nuggets from McDonald's every time they see the logo. He just doesn't stop. He doesn't stop for anything, and even when you do manage to put him down, it only just delays the inevitable encounter of facing him again later on. For most of the game, you always have the option to run away from him. But if you're up for it, you can also fight him too, and the benefits are quite nice, giving you parts for a weapon, or the first aid kit which can be a lifesaver later on. The franchise has a lot of memorable and fantastic bosses, but Nemesis stands out above them all in my opinion because of how he changes the dynamics of the gameplay. You're not just worrying about resources anymore when it comes to your typical zombies and enemies, but now you'll be wondering if you even have enough ammo for a Nemesis encounter that you have to do, knowing that he'll be back again anyways later on. He chases you in pretty much every area, and that is exactly what the remake should have done but didn't. Another year in with the PlayStation had also brought in more quality of life improvements that this game benefits from. The second game still holds up pretty well for a PS1 game, but 3 did a much better job here. I love Jill's design here, from the outfit to her animations, adding on top of her personality and voice deliveries. It makes her one of the most memorable female protagonists in gaming history. Other character models also look great, including Nemesis and his gradual evolutions. The pre-rendered backgrounds of each area that you get to explore are blessed with more objects, signs, and detail in the same level of atmosphere that was apparent in the last 2 games. Not to mention the more crisp details that stem from the PC port, and if you add the seamless HD project mod, it really stands out more. Another highlight too are the FMV cutscenes. There's more of them and they look great, especially the scenes where you see Nemesis for the first time, as well as the clock tower segment when you see the helicopter up in the air, only for Nemesis to blow it up out of nowhere. The setting of this game is such a vast improvement over RE2 by fucking miles. The combination of uptown and downtown make Raccoon City huge, full of streets, alleyways, doors that lead to other rooms, and places like the restaurant and the newspaper building. Not to mention how it even lets you return to the RPD in 2. It was a great nod to that game, and seeing Jill revisit the STARS office that she once worked in added more to what she had truly lost. A team full of capable people that she could depend on. People that had her back. Well, except for Wesker, of course. Anyway, this game simply just has more areas to explore that are not only more interesting but have more to look at. 2's RPD was fantastic, but the sewer was terrible, and the lab was decent but not as memorable as the RPD. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, however, really lets us explore Raccoon City more, with other locations like the City Hall, the Clock Tower, and the park and the factory on top of all the other places that you can see in Uptown and Downtown. 3's areas are just fantastic, and in my opinion they're just as memorable as the mansion in RE1. The series has always thrived on having areas that were interesting to explore, with information to discover that built upon the lore of the Resident Evil universe. This game is up there too in that regard, taking what was already built upon what we knew about Raccoon City and allowing us to see more of it and pick it apart. Out of the trilogy, it has the most diversity of locales, and the graphical improvements makes it the best looking game in the trilogy. All three games have the same tank controls and fixed camera angles, but each sequel also built upon what was already there and improved on it. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, I feel, peaks with this style of gameplay, at least in the RE trilogy. Movement is smooth and has some nice mechanics to shake up the experience, like the dodging mechanic. Being able to dodge the attacks of Nemesis as well as other enemies can be a lifesaver, and the pushing of zombies when done right saves a lot of ammo in the long run, but it is pretty inconsistent at times. I can't control the direction of how and where I want to dodge exactly. It automatically sets to firing mode after dodging when I actually just wanted to reposition and move instead. The pushing mechanic is also very specific and stingy. I'd wait for them to get close and it just doesn't work. It's frustrating when this happens because I end up taking damage for nothing, making me use more resources later on. But when it does work, it's wonderful. It adds more flair to the combat and overall makes it more enjoyable than 1 and 2. In terms of how you move and fight, it's pretty much the same here. You have tank controls and of course the fixed camera angles that change as you move about in the area. You tackle everything here in the same manner as well. You choose to avoid enemies, clear some and check your resources. You find key items and solve puzzles until you move on to the next area that progresses the story and do the same thing again. In the case of Nemesis, he will at times come bursting through a door, sprinting towards you. It creates some of the most intense moments in the entire game, and adds all the more reason to put him down so that he doesn't put you in awkward situations where there's other enemies like the Drain Demos insects, the hunters, or just hordes of zombies and packs of dogs lying about. The enemy roster is also quite nice here too. The Lickers are gone, but the OG hunters are back and they come in different forms. They are, however, just as annoying as they were in the first game. Zombies and dogs haven't changed at all. Other than that though, there's more of them on the map, which by the way can be circumvented by the placement of explosives. You also have worms, as well as big spider enemies that can easily be avoided. Pretty much every time I see them, I generally just run past them. And worst case scenario, if I do get poisoned, I always have blue herbs to rely upon. Another thing to point out is the targeting mode that you have now. You can point directly at either the explosives or at another enemy directly without the need to turn around and do it manually. Speaking of turning around, if you hold back and press square, you can do a full 180. This is a fantastic feature that makes running away a lot easier to do. The crafting system has also gotten a big overhaul. You now have gunpowder that you can use to craft ammunition. The manual that you have given to you regarding this has the full list of what you can craft. Oh, and continuing to craft the same ammo eventually gives you enhanced ammo, which is more efficient for taking down enemies, as well as taking down Nemesis whenever he shows up. The puzzles have the same approach here like in the previous games. It'll either be something that's easier if you have prior knowledge, like when you do the music box and you can pick up on melodies and notes. Otherwise, it's just trial and error until something else happens. The game's weapon roster is great too and is superseded by the inclusion of parts that you can obtain from putting down Nemesis enough times. You can get parts for a new pistol as well as for a shotgun. But again, you can only get them when you put Nemesis down enough times, who can take a lot of punishment unless you're using enhanced rounds or the right grenades. The game rewards you greatly for knowing how to fight him, and once you nail the dodging mechanic as well as his attacks, it becomes a lot easier every time you do fight him. Despite my frustrations in the beginning of this game, all the added mechanics, including the dodging and the 180 turning, still adds to the overall improved gameplay that is Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, which is vastly superior to the gameplay of 1 and 2. As for the game's difficulty, it's still pretty challenging here, but like the previous two, it becomes easier with both experience and memorization of enemies and how they move. You have hard and easy mode. For people that want a more forgiving experience the first time around, play easy. But even then, hard mode is still pretty manageable. You just have to learn how to be efficient with your resources, as well as knowing what enemies are worth fighting and which ones to avoid entirely, as well as knowing how Nemesis works and what you can do to circumvent his most annoying characteristics. The music of RE3 has its moments, but didn't quite grab me in the same way that RE2 did with its own soundtrack. However, the savoury music is great as always, and this game still has a lot of nice ambience that fits the overall tone and atmosphere of RE3 Nemesis. Like I've already said, the game is very short. By the time you get to the clock tower, you're not far off from the end of the game. But then again, you can still take your time and fully explore all the areas that have a lot to offer, like the areas of Uptown and Downtown when you combine them together. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is not so short to the point where it's not worth your time. What was originally supposed to be a spin-off still ended up being the best game objectively speaking in the trilogy, and horror games are generally better when they don't overstay their welcome like this game does. There's never a dull moment in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, even during the quiet moments. Nemesis fastens the game's pace and makes every encounter intense, all the while improving on the graphics, the gameplay, and the variety of locations to explore. You even have an extra mode that you can unlock after beating the game called Mercenaries Operation Mad Jackal. In this mode you get to either play as Carlos, Mikhail, or Nikolai. They have their own loadouts, but they have the same objective. Reach the objective before the timer runs out. Every kill also gives you more time, but you still need to be careful with your resources. It's a fun mode that tests your skills within the game, but it's a short experience and doesn't have as much replay value as the Mercenaries mode in the later entries. If you're looking for more side content though, then it will do, I guess. And that's the end of the original RE trilogy on the PS1. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was a fitting end to the story of Raccoon City that started all the way back to the mansion incident in Resident Evil 1. We get one of the most iconic characters in the series back facing what is arguably the best boss in the entire franchise. A boss that creates paranoia and tension from beginning to end in every area that you explore. The story is simple but clean and doesn't interfere with the horror and action of this game. The other characters are also great, like Carlos. The environments and areas are a significant improvement over RE2, which is inconsistent by comparison. Its gameplay was also better due to the quality of life improvements like ammo crafting, dodging, 180 turning, and auto-lock targeting. The life selection system also made up for the lack of different scenarios from RE2, and changes the progression of RE3's storyline, encouraging multiple playthroughs. For something that was originally meant to be a spin-off, the team did a magnificent job with RE3 Nemesis. This trilogy is a rare case where every sequel was better than the one before it. 2 was better than 1, 3 was better than 2. And best of yet, this was only a year after the release of 2 as well. And while it had its shortcomings like having only 2 bosses, the game being shorter compared to the last installments, as well as the dodging mechanic being stingy at times, 3 was the complete package, was the peak of the classic style gameplay of the Resident Evil franchise, and was a fitting end to an already amazing set of games. However, Capcom afterwards would take a bit of a nosedive with some of its spin-off games during the 2000s. They would, however, make some titles that were received well, like the Outbreak Files, Gaiden, Code Veronica, and even Dead Aim. But it would be a while until we got a game that would also be considered a masterpiece on top of the RE trilogy, which is 2005's Resident Evil 4, which would also be the beginning of the dark days of Resident Evil 7, at least until Resident Evil 7 came out. The 3 remake is a colossal disappointment, but don't let the existence of that game stop you from enjoying this masterpiece of a survival horror game. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is a banger, and definitely worth your time. Thank you for watching.
You want stars? I'll give you stars.